Welcome to the deep dive, where we really get into the nitty-gritty of your shared sources. Sort of like a shortcut to being in the know without having to go through all the heavy lifting. Today, we're going deep on techniques for getting people to tell the truth and the psychology behind it all, and our main source is this book, Get the Truth, CIA which sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, the book is written by former CIA officers, so it definitely delves into those, high-stakes scenarios, think intelligence gathering, law enforcement, that kind of thing. But what makes it super relevant for everyone, I think, is how those same principles actually play out in all sorts of everyday interactions, even like negotiating, just normal stuff.
Right, that's what we're after in this deep dive, right? To really pull out those core strategies for getting to the truth and figure out the psychology that makes them tick. And we're going to use all the juicy examples and insights from this book. So let's jump right in. One case that really stood out is this whole thing with Mary.
Oh yeah, the Mary case, definitely. It's a prime example of something called short-term thinking. So imagine this, a CIA officer, Phil. He suspects Mary, like a mid-level manager, of sharing, sensitive info with this foreign intelligence operative, Chalmers. And Chalmers is also her lover, like a romantic partner, not just a work thing. It's complicated.
Sounds messy. So what happens? They bring her in.
Yeah, and her reaction is instant, like tears, embarrassment, a whole lot of emotion.
And Phil, how does he handle that?
Well, that's the thing. He doesn't go in guns blazing. Instead, he's super gentle with her, reassures her, keeps the whole conversation very, very focused. He actually uses the term pillow talk at one point, which is pretty interesting.
Pillow talk? What, like to imply it's just casual stuff, nothing serious?
Exactly, like just trying to understand what was said in those private moments, not a full-blown interrogation, more like just narrowing things down,
Clever. And what's the result of this approach?
It works. I mean, Mary, she's just spills. She says, Phil, you don't understand? I told him everything. Like, boom, a huge confession. That completely changes the whole dynamic right there.
Wow. Okay. So now he knows. But the book talks about this ideational fluency, right? Like the ability to think on your feet and adapt. How do you even train for something like that? To just instantly shift gears like Phil had to?
That's a really good point. I mean, the book doesn't really lay out specific training methods, but I think seeing how Phil handles it, it's got to be about experience, like being in so many different situations that you can adjust quickly, always being ready for the unexpected. You can't get stuck on one idea.
Right. Like, okay, back to Mary. What did she actually tell this Chalmers guy?
Oh, man, it was bad. I mean, we're talking identities, missions of station chiefs, photos of the base, really sensitive stuff.
Seriously. And then they have to keep questioning her for, what, 8 days?
8 days, yeah. And, even though Phil, like the book mentions, he really didn't like Mary personally, kind of looked down on her choices. But he kept going, kept asking about everything, even like gifts. Did she get anything in return?
It's interesting, right? Separating your personal feelings from the mission. But at the end of those 8 days, Mary does something totally unexpected.
Tell me about it. She, thanks, Phil. Expresses gratitude for his understanding. Pretty wild, considering, what she'd done.
What do you think was going on there? Psychologically, I mean.
I think maybe even when you've messed up big time, if you feel like someone's listening, that maybe the immediate fallout is under control, it could bring a sense of relief.
Yeah.
Maybe even make you feel, I don't know, grateful towards the person who's helping you through it.
Makes sense. But then the FBI gets involved, and it seems like they completely miss what Phil had accomplished. They're treating it like just another spy case, nothing special.
Right, but one of the senior CIA counterintelligence guys, he picks up on something really important. He notices how Mary was willing to talk to Phil.
And that willingness is crucial, isn't it?
Totally. It shows how important that rapport is. Phil, by creating that safe space, however he did it, got Mary to confess. The FBI, with their, more formal approach, they just didn't have that same connection. They missed something crucial.
And then, get this, Mary fails an FBI polygraph. But without Phil's confession, all those details he got from her, they don't have enough to actually charge her. They have to let her go.
It shows you sometimes a confession isn't enough. You need solid, legally sound evidence to back it up.
Absolutely. So back to Phil, his approach. The book calls it keeping Mary in short-term thinking mode. What exactly does that mean?
Think of it like this. He kept her focused on those very specific moments, those private conversations. He limited her ability to think about the big picture. The really serious long-term consequences of what she did.
Like tunnel vision almost.
Yeah, kind of. So she's not thinking about jail time or, the legal ramifications of espionage, all that scary stuff. She's just focused on the immediate details.
Which is the opposite of what happens with the FBI.
Right. With them, all those potential consequences, they're front and center. It shifts her into long-term thinking mode. And naturally, she starts to recalculate, to reconsider what she's willing to say.
Makes sense. Oh, and there's that detail about Mary trying to leave with some jewelry. Probably gifts from Chalmers, right? But the CIA couldn't actually take it from her.
Yeah, it's a small detail, but it shows you the limitations they were working with. They just didn't have a strong enough case to do more.
So the big takeaway from Mary, the whole point of the case study, it's this idea of short-term thinking, right?
That's it. Phil, by keeping Mary focused on those immediate moments, by narrowing her options, he got the truth, something the FBI, with their broader focus, just couldn't do.
And it's funny, they use a really unexpected example to illustrate short-term thinking even further. TV shopping channels.
Yeah, you wouldn't think those two things would go together, but it makes sense, right?
In what way?
Well, think about it. Those channels are incredibly effective at getting people to buy things they probably don't need. And they do it by creating this sense of urgency, limited time offer, don't miss out, all that. It's all about instant gratification, like getting that shiny new thing right now. They don't want you thinking too hard.
Makes sense. The book even breaks down those tactics. There are like 4 main factors they use, right?
Yeah, so first, there's just our natural vulnerability to being influenced. We're all susceptible to a good sales pitch to some degree. Then there's repetition, They show you that product over and over again. You can't escape it.
I can definitely see that. And the third one is?
Loss of independent thinking. It's about the pace, Everything is so fast and exciting, you don't really have time to think critically about whether you actually need that, singing bass or whatever they're selling.
And the fourth factor, this is where it connects back to short-term thinking.
Exactly. It's lack of immediately identifiable consequences.
Yeah.
You buy that, Chia Pet, whatever, you get that immediate gratification. The credit card bill. That comes later.
The pain is delayed. Makes you think, are we vulnerable to this kind of manipulation in other areas too?
Oh, for sure. Just like Phil narrowed Mary's focus, these marketers do the same. They make you want it NW. Forget about tomorrow. They often play on that fear of missing out too. This deal won't last. It works, sadly.
It's fascinating. So back to Mary again. The book also mentions how chance played a role, like a lucky turn of phrase, they call it.
Right, because Phil's gentle approach, the whole pillow talk thing, it worked, but it could have easily backfired.
In what way?
Well, imagine if Mary had reacted differently. Instead of getting flustered, what if she'd said something calm and collected? Like, let me think about what we talked about. I'm always really careful about what I share. I'm sure I didn't say anything too sensitive. That kind of response.
Oh, like she was thinking long-term from the start.
Exactly. If she was already in that mindset, it would have been way harder for Phil to break through. It just goes to show the initial emotional state can make all the difference.
For sure. So Phil's approach, it was kind of a gamble, and he got lucky with Mary's immediate reaction. Because she was so emotional, she didn't have time to come up with a more calculated response.
Exactly. You can have the best techniques in the world, but sometimes it really comes down to how the person reacts in that moment. Now, let's talk about another case, Omar, which is all about building rapport and spotting those subtle signs of deception.
Okay, Omar. So this is Phil again, right? Questioning an informant who's usually pretty reliable, but this time, something seems off. He's hesitant, like holding back.
Right. Phil picks up on that instantly, and instead of just pushing forward, he tries to make Omar feel more comfortable. It shows how good these guys are at reading people, even the smallest changes in behavior. They're like human lie detectors.
So what does he do?
He actually lets Omar observe his religious practice, praying towards Mecca. It seems like a small thing, but it shows respect. It builds that connection, like, hey, we're on the same page here.
Interesting. And then he just comes out and asks them, right, about working for other agencies.
Yeah, pretty direct, but not aggressive, He just asks, Omar, have you ever worked for other intelligence agencies? Straightforward, nothing fancy.
And what's Omar's reaction?
Oh, he gets defensive immediately. Officer, why are you asking me this question? Is there a concern? That kind of response. When someone gets all defensive like that, it's usually a sign they're hiding something. It makes you think about how you react when you're asked direct questions. Are you giving away more than you realize?
Food for thought. And the book actually goes into the different types of questioning here, right? Interrogation, elicitation, interview. What's the difference?
So The book makes a point of saying interrogation often has this negative connotation, like forceful tactics and all that. They prefer non-coercive methods. Then you have elicitation, which is often used interchangeably with interrogation, but the focus is really on getting the person to reveal something they're trying to hide. It's more about their monologue, what you're saying.
An interview.
That's more about gathering information that the person is generally willing to share, like a back and forth, a real conversation. In Omar's case, Phil starts with an interview, but then he realizes he needs to shift to elicitation to get to the bottom of things.
Because something happens during that initial exchange. Omar gives away a tell without even realizing it.
Oh, yeah, he does. He's denying working for other agencies, but then he mentions Malaysia, which is a fictional country name Phil made up. Phil never actually said Malaysia.
So wait, Omar just used this random made-up name out of nowhere.
Yep. And that's the tell. It's what the book calls unexpected information, or a lie of commission. It's like you try to lie, but you accidentally reveal the truth within that lie.
That's so interesting. And using that made-up name, that's a pretty strong indicator that he's involved somehow, right?
Absolutely. So Phil, he takes this new info and changes his approach. He kind of acknowledges that something might have happened in the past, whatever Omar was involved in, but now he wants to focus on the present. What's Omar doing now for Malaysian intelligence?
And what does Omar reveal? What's he up to?
Well, he admits he tried to access the CIA's communications officers. The book compares them to modern-day system administrators. So pretty serious stuff. And to get to this point, Phil uses something called a transition statement.
Okay, what's that? What did he actually say?
He just says, Omar, I want to talk about the Malaysians. Direct, to the point, but not aggressive.
And Omar, how does he react to that?
At first, he's all, Malaysians, I don't know any Malaysians, denials. But Phil, he keeps going. Calm, steady questioning. And eventually Omar cracks. He admits to some past contact with Malaysian intelligence, but he claims it was because he was desperate for money. Which, even when people are caught red-handed, they still try to justify their actions.
Like human nature, I guess. But Phil, he doesn't jump down his throat, right?
Not at all. He actually validates Omar's past work, reminds him that he's still valuable. It's smart, It keeps Omar on their side, prevents him from completely shutting down, shows how important validation is.
So even when someone's lied, even when they've messed up, showing some understanding, acknowledging their perspective, it can lead to better results. Makes sense. Okay, let's talk about Leo. His case is all about spotting deception and the importance of being persistent but gentle.
Right, so Leo, he's being questioned by Phil again, same guy. And the question is, has he ever worked for another intelligence service? And like Omar, he hesitates. But Phil, he tries to put Leo at ease, uses this encouraging tone, tries to build some trust.
Okay, and what happens?
Well, Leo starts telling this story about meeting a guy named Otto at the World Cup. And Otto introduces him to Horace, who's a friend living in the U.S., in the same city where Leo ends up studying.
It sounds a little rehearsed, like he's thought about this story before.
Okay, and this Horace, what's his deal? Why is he important?
Horace is really interested in Leo's job as a research assistant. His professor, you see, he advises U.S. policymakers, so pretty high-level stuff. Horace wants to know everything about the professor's government work. It's a little suspicious.
And does Leo give him anything?
He eventually admits to giving Horace some documents related to the professor's work. He's been compromised, but it seems like it happened slowly, little by little.
And then Phil asks this seemingly simple question that changes everything.
Yeah, he just says, Leo, you said like you. Like who? It's like he's asking him to clarify something he said earlier, but it's really a way to see if there's more to the story.
And does Leo answer?
He does, but reluctantly. He just says FIS, and that's it.
And FIS is Fran Intelligence Service. One word, and everything changes.
Wow. And Leo's friend, Knight, he's listening to all this from the bathroom. Can you imagine hearing your friend admit to working for another intelligence service?
I can't even imagine. He's got to be devastated. But in the end, he agrees they have to keep digging for the truth. And Phil, he's smart. He knows how heavy this is for both of them. He gives Leo a break. It's a human moment, in the middle of all this espionage.
Definitely. And then things get even more complicated, right? Because Leo reveals something pretty bad about Knight.
Oh, yeah. He admits that after meeting Knight at school, he told Fran Intelligence about him because he thought Knight might be working for the CIA or the FBI. And they actually encouraged him to get close to Knight. It's crazy how deep this goes, the betrayal and the manipulation.
So we've seen these cases play out, but the book also goes into more detail about some of the specific techniques, right?
Yeah, they highlight some really specific things you can do, like slow your rate of speech, It creates a calmer atmosphere, shows you're in control, and it can encourage the other person to slow down too. It's like setting the pace.
That's interesting. And another one is to really engage the person you're talking to.
Right, put away your notes, make eye contact, really focus on them. It reduces their anxiety and shows that you're actually listening, not just going through the motions.
And the third one is to lower your voice.
Exactly. It's less confrontational. You create a more intimate setting. It's like you're inviting them into a private conversation.
Okay, so these techniques are interesting, but do they actually work on people who are, truly evil or just really hardened criminals? That's a question I think a lot of people have.
The book addresses that directly. They challenge the idea that evil people are somehow immune to non-coercive methods. It's like we can't assume everyone thinks the same way we do. We can't project our own logic onto them. What seems logical to us might not make sense to someone with a totally different worldview.
And they have this great quote in the book about that.
Yeah, it says, human behavior and logic do not necessarily have a cause and effect relationship. It's a reminder that we're all different. What motivates one person might not motivate another.
That's a good point. Now, the book also talks about the spirit virus, which sounds pretty intense. What is that exactly?
The spirit virus is basically what happens in our minds when we get bad news or unsettling information. We start to freak out, imagine all these horrible consequences. It's a total anxiety spiral, like a mental domino effect.
They use the example of getting a call from Detective Williams. I mean, that alone would make me nervous.
Totally. You immediately start thinking, what did I do? Is someone I know in trouble? It's all those worst-case scenarios flooding your mind. And that kind of anxiety can make it really hard to think clearly.
So how does Phil use this spirit virus to his advantage?
Instead of focusing on blame or punishment, he tries to get the person, like Leo, to focus on solving the situation. He uses phrases like, we need to figure this out, understand what happened, and find a solution. It's about shifting their mindset from, oh no, I'm in trouble, to, okay, let's fix this.
So he makes it a collaborative effort, like they're working together to solve a problem rather than, a suspect being interrogated.
Exactly. And by focusing on finding the cause of the situation, it allows the person to start thinking about the next steps. And it kind of subtly implies that any negative consequences are a result of their own actions. It encourages them to take responsibility and cooperate.
That's really interesting. And then there's this verbal judo technique, the idea of agreeing with someone before you transition to a more difficult topic.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. It's about disarming their potential defensiveness. So before you address the sensitive issue, you start by agreeing with them on something or validating their perspective. Like in the example with Jane and the missed medication, you could say something like, Jane, you're absolutely right. Everyone here knows how dedicated you are to your work.
So you acknowledge her positive qualities before you hit her with the problem.
Exactly. And then you transition to the issue. And because of that dedication, we need to understand what happened with the medication schedule. By starting with agreement, it's less likely she'll immediately get defensive.
Clever. Now, how do they handle emotional outbursts? I imagine those happen a lot in these situations. People crying, getting angry, even violent.
The book mentions a couple of tactics. The first one is simple. Just say the person's name. When someone's in the middle of an emotional outburst, hearing their name can kind of snap them out of it, even if it's just for a second.
It's like a reset button. And the other tactic?
The second one is to give a clear, calm directive. Like, Jane, wait a moment, or Jane, let me clarify. It's about taking control of the conversation without being aggressive. You're basically interrupting the emotional momentum.
Makes sense. Now, the book talks about this Norman case and the importance of probing for the worry, the underlying issue that's bothering someone.
Right. So with Norman, Phil notices he's agitated, like something's on his mind, but it's not about the immediate topic.
Yeah.
So he does this thing called a trial balloon. He basically throws out a possibility to see if it sticks. He says, Norman, I've been watching you. Something's clearly bothering you. And then he casually suggests that maybe it's a girlfriend problem, even though he has no idea if that's true.
And did Norman react to that?
He did. He just slowly nods. That one nonverbal cue tells Phil that he's on the right track. There's definitely something personal going on.
So then he can ask directly, what's bothering you?
Exactly. And it works. Even though Norman's probably experienced with this kind of questioning, he opens up. And the book suggests that it's because Phil recognized and addressed that underlying emotional state. He saw the person, not just the potential liar.
Interesting. Another thing that seems counterintuitive is that even when someone admits to doing something wrong, you shouldn't reprimand them right away. You should actually encourage them to keep talking.
It does seem strange, but
Yeah.
the point is to keep that information flowing. If you immediately criticize someone or threaten punishment, they're going to shut down. They won't tell you anything else, even if it's important.
So you have to bite your tongue and just let them keep talking.
Exactly. Acknowledge their honesty. Even a simple thank you can go a long way. You want to reinforce the idea that telling the truth, even when it's hard, is the right thing to do.
Now, there's this case, the Kevin case, where a confession comes out of nowhere.
Oh, yeah. This one's funny. Susan, she's talking to Kevin, and she starts with this line like, Kevin, whatever you're going to say, I've heard it all before. Like she's expecting some typical excuse.
Yeah.
But then Kevin just blurts out this completely unexpected confession.
What does he say?
He confesses to dancing naked on a bar, publicly. Apparently, his wife had no idea. It was not what Susan was expecting at all.
Definitely not the kind of intel she was looking for. But the book emphasizes her reaction or lack thereof. Why was that so important?
Because even though it was totally irrelevant to what she was doing, she stayed calm. She didn't make a big deal out of it. And that prevents things from getting awkward or damaging their rapport. You have to be adaptable in these situations, You never know what people are going to say.
That's for sure. Okay, let's talk about Marvin. His case shows how important it is to pay attention to details and ask precise questions.
Right, so Susan, she's talking to Marvin, and she notices something's not quite right with his timeline. He's talking about his past drug use and when he graduated high school, and the dates just don't add up. So instead of accusing him of lying, she just asks for clarification. She says something like, Marvin, can you help me understand the timeline of these events? Very polite, but direct.
And what happens? Does he correct himself?
He does. He realizes he's been caught and admits that his last drug use was actually more recent than he initially claimed. It shows you how powerful observation and careful questioning can be. Sometimes just pointing out a discrepancy is enough to get someone to tell the truth.
Now, the book shifts gears a bit and talks about how these elicitation skills can be used in everyday situations, like buying a car. Susan talks about her experiences with those pushy car salespeople. I think we've all been there.
Oh, for sure. It can be so frustrating. The pressure tactics, the manipulation. The book calls those moments cliff moments, where you feel like you're about to be pushed into a bad decision. And the key, they say, is to be prepared. Do your research beforehand. Know what you want and what you're willing to pay.
In Susan, she actually uses this approach successfully with a salesman named Steve. How does she manage to get a better trade-in value?
She comes in armed with information. She knows how much her trade-in is worth, and she's clear about her budget. She communicates that directly to Steve, and she also reminds him of the dealership's reputation for fair deals. It's about setting boundaries and appealing to their sense of fairness.
Smart. Okay, let's talk about a more sensitive topic, firing someone. The book uses this case, the Jack termination, to illustrate the importance of no harm.
Right, so they have to fire this guy, Jack, who has access to sensitive information. And they decide to take a very gentle approach. They ask for his keys and ID, tell him to take a few days off, and promise to call him on Monday. It's all very low-key, trying to minimize the immediate stress and avoid any drama.
But there's this moment of suspense, right? As Jack is leaving.
Yeah, he's driving toward the gate, and he slows down and rolls down his window. And for a second, they think maybe he's going to pull out a gun or something, It's pretty tense.
But then he does something unexpected.
He just thanks them and wishes them well. It really emphasizes that principle of no harm. You want the person to leave without feeling angry or resentful, especially someone who had access to sensitive information.
The Ronald theft case, this one is all about the danger of confirmation bias, right?
Exactly. So at the farm, which is the CIA training facility, $40 goes missing. And everyone immediately suspects Ronald because he was the only one with access to that area. It's a classic example of how confirmation bias can lead you astray. You focus on the evidence that supports your initial belief and ignore anything that contradicts it.
And Phil, he recognizes this potential bias in himself, right?
Yeah, he knows he could easily fall into that trap. So he makes a conscious effort to stay objective, even though everything seems to point to Ronald. He doesn't want to jump to conclusions.
And in the end, what happens?
Ronald does confess, but only after they confront him with solid evidence. A witness saw him with a wad of cash. It just goes to show you can't rely on assumptions. You have to investigate thoroughly and be open to other possibilities.
Now, there's this case, Mike's approach with Ralph, where they're dealing with a very sensitive situation. Ralph is suspected of inappropriate behavior with a minor, Judy.
Yeah, this one's tough. Mike's approach is all about minimizing the potential consequences for Ralph and giving him a way to rationalize his actions. He tells Ralph that he doesn't see him as a typical offender and even suggests that Judy might have been the instigator. He's walking a fine line there.
That's a tricky strategy for sure.
It is. It raises some ethical questions, but the book presents it as a tactic to get information. Mike also tries to downplay the age difference and talks about how things can get ambiguous in the workplace, but he never actually condones the behavior. His main message is that they want to protect Ralph's career.
And did it work? Did Ralph cooperate?
According to the book, yes. He goes along with Mike's framing of the situation and starts to open up. He probably feels relieved that things might not be as bad as he thought.
The book then gets really practical and gives some general tips for elicitation and interrogation. It's like a cheat sheet for getting people to talk.
Absolutely. They emphasize organization. You have to be prepared and show that you've done your homework. They also recommend a team approach. One person leads the questioning, the other observes and takes notes. And it's important to start by explaining why you're having this conversation, Be upfront about it.
What about note-taking? Should you take notes during the conversation?
Initially, they say no. Taking notes can create a barrier. It makes things feel more formal. You want to keep the person in that short-term thinking mode. They also say to focus on the key questions. Don't get sidetracked. Don't rush the conversation. Let there be pauses. Silence can be powerful. And most importantly, be respectful. Maintain a calm, non-confrontational demeanor throughout the interaction.
Now, they dedicate a whole section to the importance of liking and avoiding being disliked. Why is that so important?
It's basic human nature. People are more likely to cooperate with someone they like. Building that rapport is crucial.
And they quote this lawyer, Jim, who gives some interesting advice.
Jim says to treat everyone you meet like a potential juror. It's about being mindful of how you come across. Even small interactions matter, because you never know who might end up judging you later.
It's about making a good impression, and they talk about the power of small gestures too, right?
Yeah, a kind word, a smile, a little act of thoughtfulness can go a long way. They tell this story about a judge who treated a convicted felon with respect. And the guy was so grateful for it. It was unexpected. It just shows the power of basic human decency.
It's about treating people like human beings, even when they've done bad things. Now, they also talk about negotiation as collaboration, which seems relevant here.
It all ties together, right? It's about approaching these conversations, whether it's questioning someone or negotiating a deal, with a calm, non-aggressive attitude. You want to understand the other person's perspective and try to find solutions that work for both sides. It's not about forcing a confession or winning at all costs.
So they're advocating for a more cooperative approach rather than an adversarial one.
Exactly. And they'll give some examples of what not to do, like demanding default judgments in legal cases. They talk about how judges hate that kind of aggressive tactic. The CIA approach, they say, is to make it a collaborative effort. Don't burn bridges.
And then there's this concept of rationalizing mistakes and resolving cognitive dissonance. Can you explain that a bit?
So cognitive dissonance is that feeling you get when you have two conflicting beliefs, or when your actions don't align with your values. It's uncomfortable. The book even mentions Orwell's doublethink here. And the idea is that if you understand this discomfort, you can use it to your advantage when you're trying to elicit information. You can provide a way for someone to reconcile their bad actions with their self-image.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Give me an example.
Well, they talk about a contractor who's overbilled for a project. To deal with